Hello and welcome to Truth Be Told. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for taking the time to watch this today, and I hope you're encouraged by it in the Lord and in your own life. We started a series last time called Virtue Signaling. More specifically, Christian virtue signaling. Virtue signaling in the world has to do with I tell you something that I do, or I take a selfie snapshot of myself doing something, but I don't really do it. Somebody else's, I'm telling you something that you should do, but I don't really do it. Christian virtue signaling is living out the virtue, actually acting the virtue out. We're not talking about just taking a selfie of our lives for a media shot. We're talking about how do we live out the virtues of Christ, live out the character of Christ to signal to those around us, hey, there's a better way to live. There's a right way to live. There is a less confusing way to live. It is in Christ through Christian virtue signaling. Last time we talked about honesty, the complete virtue. Honesty being coming from a word similar to integrity. Integrity being coming from a word of means integer, which is a whole number in math. Take away part of the number and you have a fraction. So honesty is integrity, which is a whole. It makes us complete, makes us whole in terms of our life and the way we present ourselves. So today we're talking about the serious virtue, and it is serious. It is godliness. The serious virtue of godliness. No greater compliment, no greater compliment can be paid to a Christian than for them to be referred to as a godly person, a godly Christian. That is the highest compliment a Christian can receive. You see, godliness is not an option in the development of Christian character. The Apostle Peter instructs us in 2 Peter 1:6 to add endurance to our godliness. Godliness is supposed to be a given. It's supposed to be a natural. It's supposed to be what we're pursuing anyway as followers of Jesus Christ. And godliness is not reserved for a few old-timey Christians of a bygone era or a small group of super saints today, the super-duper preachers and super-duper people that are on YouTube and criticizing other people because they are better and holier and all this kind of stuff. The privilege and the duty of every Christian is to pursue, to study, and to practice godliness. It's to be something that we're consumed with. We are to be consumed with imitating Christ, consumed with becoming more like Christ. Now, when Paul was writing in Titus, he was writing to Titus in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. It's just assumed that you're going to pursue godliness. You're going to pursue wanting to be more like God. Again, in Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Paul says this, "For the grace of God appeared that offers salvation to all people." All people are being invited. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. The grace of God is teaching us to pursue godly lives. So what does it mean to be godly? What does it mean to be godly? I know that's what you're asking, and here's what we're going to answer. In order to be godly, do I have to live in a monastery someplace? Does it mean that I can't watch television? Does it mean that I can't listen to rock and roll? Can a person be godly and yet be competitive in business, or godly and achieve financial success? Can a person do that? And by the same token, can a person be talented, involved in God's work, and even successful in some Christian aspect of service and still not be godly? Let's talk about that today. What does it mean to be godly? Simply this: godliness means taking God seriously. God says this, I take him seriously. We don't play games with God. The heartbeat of the godly person is to desire, to respect, to reverence, and to obey God. That's the heartbeat of a godly person. I want to respect God. I want to reverence God. I want to obey God. A godly person does not equate to a boring life, by the way, because a godly life is enjoying the life of the Creator. The Creator has designed her to live this life. The essence of a godly life is saying yes to God and no to anything that offends God. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but he puts his Spirit within us to accomplish that and be able to make that happen. Let's go way back, the book of Exodus and all through the Old Testament. The Israelites were a people who failed to take God seriously. You know, God had delivered them from the Egyptians. They had been enslaved in Egypt for 400 plus years. And on their journey home, God had delivered them on the journey home to the promised land. They witnessed the miracle of God parting the Red Sea and then killed the Egyptian army that was pursuing them by allowing the Red Sea to come on back on top of them. Swallowed them up. These people had everything. I mean, God guided them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. God delivered them through the Red Sea. God's leader Moses was out in front of them, giving them complete confidence in who God is. God provided nourishment in the form of manna from heaven and water from the rock and quail from the coast. It sounded like they had unparalleled privileges. It did, didn't it? God's presence was constant. His working was evident. They had been given a heritage of godliness. In fact, one would think that these people had they would be the epitome of godliness. But they weren't. They weren't. The Apostle Paul wrote of these people, the Israelites that were supposedly following God, in 1 Corinthians 10:5. But God was not pleased with most of them, for they were struck down in the desert. In other words, they were killed. God killed an awful lot of them because they just played games. As they journeyed from Egypt, they played games with their lives. They played games with God, and that was a dangerous way to live, and he revealed that. And because many of these people had just been delivered from Egypt, from slavery for 400 years, they didn't take God seriously, and they began to live in ways that offended God's holiness. God killed them. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, said in 1 Corinthians 10:7, don't become idolaters like some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to play. Sounded like maybe a frat party was taking place, right? I mean, the supernatural had become commonplace. God talk was everywhere, and yet they lacked a reverence and an awe for God. They got used to God. They became very calloused to his presence. They became nonchalant in their values. They forgot their heritage. Apathy was running rampant. They stopped taking God seriously, and they began to take God for granted. And as a result, they walked in disobedience to God, thinking everything was cool, but it wasn't cool. Sound familiar? Never in the history of the world has one country, our country, the United States of America, been so blessed. I mean, we're inundated with churches, Christian radio and television, Christian magazines and books, Christian schools, Christian conferences, Christian seminars, preaching on YouTube like this one, and on and on and on. Never has the potential for religious instruction been so paramount in society or any society. Our churches should be overflowing with godly men and women. But are they? I mean, all too often we walk down the same path of carnality that these ancient Hebrews, the Israelites, did years and years ago. We make light of what we should honor, we wink at what we should weep about, and we play with what we should take quite seriously. I mean, how often do we go to church and we experience an emotional high? The music is revved, the lights are flashing, this is going on, that's going on, man, it is a party atmosphere. And we get all emotional, we have this emotional high, we pretend it was God's presence, but we leave no different than we came. Let me ask you, do you take God seriously? Do you take God seriously? If you do, you're on your way to godliness. How do you know if you're godly? How do you know if you're taking God seriously? How do you know if you're radiating the presence of God? Well, here's the thing. A few things here. People who take God seriously thirst for God. I mean, there's probably has been a point in time in the past, and there will be in the future, when we become so thirsty, getting something to drink is all we can think of. And we do whatever we had to get a drink. If we want to be godly, we've got to long and thirst for God. David was such a man. He says in Psalm 42, verses 1 and 2, he expresses it very clearly. As a deer longs for streams of water. He's probably being chased. He's running. It's hot. So I long for you, God. I thirst for God, the living God. When can I come and appear before God, he says. David wanted to be in the presence of God more than anything else. Let me attest to the fact that there is nothing more important, more precious, more valuable than the presence of God. Intensity for God is the heartbeat of a godly person. Herb Caen, a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle some time ago, he wrote this in the Chronicle. Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows it must run faster than the fastest lion or it will be killed. Every morning, a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. Cain concluded, it doesn't matter whether you're a lion or gazelle. When the sun comes up, you'd better be running. The great British preacher Charles Spurgeon says this from a century ago. He says, if you're not seeking the Lord, the devil is seeking you. If you're not seeking the Lord, judgment is at your heels. Heels? My southern's coming out. In the pursuit of godliness, it's not enough to simply wake up. We're called to wake up and actively pursue becoming like Christ, to press into godliness. Godliness doesn't come to us by passively sitting aside and it drops in our lap. It requires hard work. It requires enduring perseverance and a very strong continued effort. In a matter of speaking, you have to pursue it with everything you've got. The godly person is content in their relationship with God, but they are never satisfied with the present experience. They always want more. The question is, are you actively pursuing and thirsting for God? People who take God seriously thirst for God, and then they also focus their lives on God. The pursuer of godliness focuses attention on God in all things. The trouble and the tragedy of modern man is that we tend to divert our focus away from God, don't we? We are so easily distracted. I mean, it's quite possible to be an idolater today. An idol is anything that draws our focus and our pursuit away from God to whatever that is that we're looking at. I mean, look in Paul's day. Idolatry was a big problem in Paul's day. In his letter to Timothy, he says that he talks about godliness being discussed in reference to two particular idols. The first was bodily exercise. Hello? He says in 1 Timothy 4, 7 and 8, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself in godliness. It takes training. It takes focus. For the training of the body has a limited benefit, but godliness is beneficial in every way, since it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. The first was bodily exercise. The second was money. But godliness, he says in 1 Timothy 6 and verses 10 to 11, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Now you, man of God, run from these things, but pursue righteousness and godliness. Paul was rightly and correctly addressing the problem of many 21st century Americans. The age of physical fitness and monetary gain is pretty much upon us. And there's nothing wrong or sinful inherently in these things and being fit and looking buff and all that kind of thing and getting exercise and having money. There's nothing wrong with these things until they distract us from pursuing God with all of our heart. There was a man I read recently about who had spent his whole life making money, hoarding money. He found himself in a very disturbed and unhappy place, and he went to his pastor for counsel. The minister who knew the man very well picked up the Bible. He pointed to the word God. It just said the word God. And he asked the man, he said, can you see the word God? Absolutely, I can see the word God. And the pastor said, okay, fine. So he picked up a coin big enough to cover the word and he put it over the word God. And he says, now, can you see the word God? It took him a couple minutes. And then he says, I understand. Jerry Bridges says this about godliness. Godliness is an exercise or discipline that focuses upon God. Here's a question. What are you doing to focus your life on God? Have you allowed the cares and the worries of the world to blur your vision of God? Here's a critical question. What habits have you developed to keep yourself spiritually fit? Have you created habits that you maintain for the purpose of keeping yourself focused on God? People take God seriously. They thirst for God. They focus on God and they worship God alone. They worship God alone. To worship God is to put God in his place. You ever put God in his place? To worship God is to acknowledge God as sovereign. That means he's in full control. He is the one who there's no one above him from whom he gets permission or praise. There's no one beside him from whom he gets advice or counsel. He is holy, he is sinless, he is faultless, he is flawless, beyond our understanding. To worship God is to give him all of us, all of me. The godly person removes him or herself from the center of our world and puts God in his rightful place. In fact, the Greek word for godliness embodies the idea of worship rightly directed. The reverence of God will cause us to worship God rightly. Far too often we take God too lightly. I've said this before. I will continue to say this. We approach God in a trite and a casual fashion. We think of God as our buddy or our pal. But the fact is, this is the eternal God, the God of the universe, who has a claim on our lives because he's the one who has put eternity in our hearts. We are to approach him with dignity and respect and reverence. Reverence of God will also regulate our conduct. John Murray puts it this way: what or whom we worship determines our behavior. In other words, if a person worships basketball or sports, all their conduct and behavior is consumed with sports or that basketball or that sport, whatever that may be. If a person worships money and their whole life is consumed with getting money and having money and maybe your idol is debt and you're staying in debt your whole life. If a person is consumed with anything but God, they worship that item. Who or what are you worshiping? Who or what is getting your focus today? People who take God seriously thirst for God. They focus on God. They worship God alone, and they serve other people. As we invest time with God, he will guide us to serve other people. Godly people know that service is an outgrowth of worship. Jesus told the Jewish law expert that the most important command in the world was to love God with every fiber of our being, but the evidence of that love for God was our serving of other people, treating our neighbor as ourselves, God loving them through us. The best evidence of godliness is not the monk who lives in a monastery secluded away from people. It is the best evidence of godliness is the person who lives in the midst of crying children and busy schedules and foul-mouthed workers and rain-soaked days by serving other people. The question is, whom are you serving? Will you mean business with God, or will you be content just playing the game? Does your religion come out of a transformed heart, or is it superficial for some social media selfie shots? Do you speak the Christian lingo but fail to live the life of godliness? We're talking about Christian virtue signaling. We're talking about removing ourselves from the world of social media snapshots to signal to the world around us that there is a better way to live. The Christian virtue of godliness is a serious virtue. The life of godliness will not come easy. All of the courage, all of the discipline, all the persistence you can muster will be needed to take God seriously. And that's why he puts his Spirit within us. Godliness may not be an easy life, but it is a distinguishable life. The godly person takes on the stamp that reflects the very stamp of God. People will notice such a reflection. Other people will take notice. But so will God. Are you living the serious life of godliness, the serious virtue of portraying what it means to put God first, above all, in place of all, so that God is worshiped seriously? I hope you have a great day today, and may God bless you in your pursuit of him. Bye now.